Hello, let me tell you a story. On April 4, 2013, a middle-aged man was caught raiding the storage room of Pine Tree Camp, a summer camp facility for disabled children. After being arrested, the mysterious man was questioned by the police.
Address? None. Where is your mail sent? No mail. What address do you put on your tax return? No tax returns. Where are your disability checks sent? No checks. Where's your vehicle? No vehicle. Who do you live with? No one. Where do you live? The woods. How long have you been living in the woods? Decades. Since what year? What year was the Chernobyl nuclear plant disaster?
This person turned out to be Christopher Knight, a 47-year-old man who had entered the North Pond area located in Maine on 1986, when he was 20 years old. Here, he built a camp where he would live in secret for...
When authorities asked Knight why he lived in the woods so long by himself, he had no reason to give. In fact, he said he often asked himself that same question.
The days following his arrest, Knight became a national sensation, and the media couldn't stop trying to get a piece of the story. But as hundreds of journalists were rejected by Knight himself, there was one that managed to get his curiosity. That man was Michael Finkel. Finkel established contact with Knight by sending him a personal letter. Knight found the content interesting and replied. This eventually led to Finkel visiting him during his first weeks of imprisonment, and a peculiar relationship began. After that first encounter, Finkel wrote an article about the whole incident for GQ, but his fascination with the case led him to keep in touch with Knight. This would ultimately become The Stranger in the Woods. In his book, Finkel explains how Knight survived for almost 3 decades alone in the wild, braving the elements, the hunger, and most of all, the isolation, which in turn becomes the core subject of the story. The year is 1986. Knight had recently quit his job installing security systems and had gone on a road trip on his own, driving his newly acquired 1985 Subaru Brat. This trip eventually ended and he headed home. But while he was driving back to Maine, an idea grew in his head. He drove by his house one last time, took a look around, and then kept on driving, leaving behind several siblings and both parents. I drove until I was nearly out of gas. I took a small road, then a small road off that small road, then a trail off that. He parked the car, left the keys on the center console, took a tent he had in his trunk, and started walking, until he eventually faded away into the forest. He found a clearing that was hidden by several huge boulders. He decided to set his camp here. In time, he upgraded his living conditions by flattening the ground with handmade blocks built with old magazines. For fear of being caught, he never lit a fire during his 27 years living there.
By approaching from an angle, turn the stove off, remove from the source of heat, and move away.
What did Knight do to feed himself? Well, this is where the story gets complicated, and is actually the origin of his legend in North Pond.
The secret ingredient is crime.
He stole. Apparently, his camping site was located near a camp area with lots of cabins. Most of them had the minimal security measures, so this place became the perfect raiding ground for a patient and discreet man as Christopher Knight. He would observe families, taking advantage of the perfect cover the forest provided, and pick the cabins that looked vacant. Then, in the dead of night, he would quietly force his entry and take anything that he deemed necessary for survival. He also stole hundreds of books to keep himself entertained, some classics, some poetry, and more. Not all the books he stole were for reading. It took a long time for the temporary residents of North Pond to realize there was a serial burglar in their midst. This is when the myth was born. And he went by many names: Mountain Man, Hungry Man, Hermit, and the Hermit of North Pond, which gradually settled as the North Pond Hermit. But was Christopher Knight really a hermit? In the book, Finkel elaborates on the cultural significance of Eremitism throughout history, which has seen its fair share of fascinating hermits. The Desert Fathers and Mothers, led by Saint Anthony, started living inside the limestone caves located on the shores of the Nile River, where they had a major influence on the development of Christianity. In the 6th century before Christ, a Chinese hermit called
Lao Zi,
wrote a text titled
道德经,
which was not only the first great literary work about solitude, but has also become a fundamental text for Taoism. It claims that knowing others is intelligence, knowing yourself is true wisdom. In the Middle Ages, hundreds of people became anchorites. They voluntarily lived in tiny dark cells attached to Christian churches, believing this type of existence would bring them closer to God. During the 70s, Japan saw the emergence of a particular group of people known as hikikomori. They are defined by being extremely secluded individuals who make a great effort to almost never leave their homes. It is estimated that between 700,000 and a million people live in these conditions currently in Japan. Curiously enough, none of these people were as isolated from other human beings for as much time as Christopher Knight. There are 3 kinds of hermits. The protesters. Due to discontent with their government or society, they simply leave their lives behind to live off the grid. These kind of hermits don't want anything to do with the decaying world that surrounds them. The pilgrims. Their goal is religious. They believe that seclusion will bring them a spiritual awakening, and their beliefs will expand and grow stronger. Most religious figures have at some point practiced some kind of seclusion. The pursuers. They seek isolation as a means to achieve artistic inspiration or scientific insight. They wish to explore their inner self to try and understand themselves and the world around them better. So, what type of hermit was Christopher Knight? Apparently, none. I can't explain my actions. I had no plans when I left. I wasn't thinking of anything. I just did it. Knight didn't go looking for a spiritual awakening. He didn't set to create a significant work of art. He didn't even bother to document his life in the forest with pictures or a journal. And he wasn't really discontent with society. He wanted to get lost. He simply wanted to be left alone. So, what did he do with all that free time then? Well, actually, he did nothing. Meditation, thinking about things. Thinking about whatever I wanted to think about. About his crimes, Knight confessed he performed about 40 raids each year. So, after doing this for 27 years, it would create a total of around 1,000 burglaries. He claims he did not know of any other way to sustain himself without giving his location away. Every time, I was very conscious that I was doing wrong. I took no pleasure in it, none at all. After a brief legal procedure, Knight spent 7 months in jail and paid $2,000 in restitution to the victims he stole from. He then went back to live with his siblings and mother. But the question comes up again and again: who would do something like this and why? Finkel makes a witty remark about it in his book. He writes, "Everyone dreams of dropping out of the world once in a while. Then you get in the car and drive back home." Christopher Knight claims he didn't have a concrete plan, or a purpose he wanted to achieve. Since childhood, he always had trouble being around other people. He wasn't particularly bullied at school, but he didn't enjoy it either. He didn't have problems at home. However, he didn't have an issue with leaving his own family behind. He enjoyed his job, but he disliked being around his co-workers. As he left his car parked in the middle of the forest and started walking, Knight claims he felt an unexplainable attraction to the woods. He mentioned he found it peaceful there and simply wanted to enjoy it on his own. According to Finkel, Knight was a very straightforward man, saying he even hated the idea of people seeing him as some kind of wisdom-spewing hermit that had reached some sort of enlightenment while living in the cold woods of Maine. But he did say something peculiar about his whole experience. It's complicated. Solitude bestows an increase in something valuable. I can't dismiss that idea. Solitude increased my perception. But here's the tricky thing. When I applied my increased perception to myself, I lost my identity. There was no audience, no one to perform for. There was no need to define myself. I became irrelevant. My desires dropped away. I didn't long for anything. I didn't even have a name. To put it romantically, I was completely free. In an increasingly loud world, can we really blame Knight for trying to escape it? It has become harder and harder to find silence in our daily lives, and what better place to find this than in nature? We can come upon it in the middle of a forest, at the top of a mountain, or even submerged underwater. And when we find true silence, our brain enters a different world altogether, a place that, we may realize, has been missing in our lives. I don't want to get into scientific studies or quotes about famous people that talk about the mental and physical benefits of solitude. You can find those in the web by the dozens. However, I'd like to reflect on something most of us have just gone through. Solitude is probably a concept most of us are familiar with right now, after spending essentially 2 years living a somewhat secluded lifestyle. What makes it even more peculiar is that even though we nowadays have all the means to stay connected, we still felt alone at one point or another. At times, that loneliness felt unbearable. Yet, here we are, probably not unscathed, but I bet that all of you, just like me, learned a lot these last few years, even if in this case, the isolation was imposed upon us. Solitude is, after all, a skill, and skills can be improved. Next time you find yourself in an isolated situation, try to focus on the stillness that silence brings, and you may hear something you haven't before. Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk, wrote that nothing can be expressed about solitude that has not already been said better by the wind in the pine trees. I really don't know if there's any meaning in Knight's actions, but I love the idea that because he doesn't spell it out, the reader is forced to reflect upon their own place in the world. Things don't have to be happening all the time, and it's actually okay to sometimes just do nothing. If we spend enough time in solitude, it may actually teach us something, and if we do learn anything in that quiet place, why not share it with the world? Christopher McCandless had to spend several months in the wild and paid the ultimate price to realize that happiness is only real when shared. So, I don't know about you, but in the meantime, I'll be in the forest. Until we meet again.